Hot off the press, here's my review of the December 23 AAA exam paper. And the usual caveat, I haven't seen the exam paper. This is all based on things my students have told me. So thank you to everyone who gave me so much detail. Now, big picture first of all. Most of my students felt like this was an okay set of questions. General feeling, not from all, but the general feeling is this was a very fair set of questions. But there were some weird bits too, and we'll come to those shortly. I was pretty happy with what came up in this exam. I made 4 predictions before the exam. I predicted that reporting to those charged with governance would come up, and it did. I predicted that it'd be a big quality management question, and there was. I predicted that there'd be lots of technical accounting issues, and there were. The one I predicted that didn't come up was cash flow forecasts. And actually there weren't any non-audit engagements at all across the exam variants, which was rather unusual. So in this recording, we'll have an executive summary of key messages, key things that came out of the exam, and then I'll go through each of the different exam questions in a little bit more detail. So here are my big takeaways from the December 23 AAA exam. The first is that there weren't many tech issues, particularly with remote invigilation. Yes, the odd isolated issue, but not many. And a few exam centres had issues, and I know that if you were affected by those, they're very personally damaging, but actually, big picture, across all of the exam centres, there were relatively few this time around. So ACCA seemed to have really sorted their act out, particularly with remote invigilation. So that's a big thumbs up from me. In total, there were far less question variants this time. Many more students got the same questions. ACCA teams seem to change this every time. We can't say whether there's going to be lots of questions or not so many. But my feeling is that going forward, there probably will be fewer because that creates less work for ACCA. Now, very strangely, in this exam, there were 2 pure knowledge questions where you weren't expected to use the scenario to come up with ideas, where you had to apply your knowledge. It relied on you just having the knowledge. We haven't seen any questions like this in AAA for many years. And there was no hint from the examining team that we would get lots of pure knowledge questions. Now, if you got both knowledge questions, that was about 13 marks across the entire exam. So it was a significant part of the exam paper, but with good exam technique and a bit of background knowledge, you would still have been able to pick up marks on those questions, even if you weren't really prepared for a pure knowledge question. Now, going forward, I don't expect that to be the theme of the AAA exam going into the future. I see this as a one-off, but I really don't know. I'm in the same position as you. There was lots of emphasis on financial reporting, particularly in one of the Section A questions, but actually across all variants of the exam and all questions, there was an emphasis on financial reporting. And this is something the examiner has been highlighting and is something they've been doing regularly, so is something I expect to see happening more in the future. Now, there was a heavy emphasis in one of the question ones on groups. Lots of accounting issues and auditing issues around group accounting and managing a group audit with component auditors. Now, this is something the examiner flagged in a technical article. So it shows the value before your exam of making sure you have read those technical articles. Now, in the reporting questions, the examiner continued their recent approach, which was to really focus on extra paragraphs. Things like key audit matters, emphasis of matter, material uncertainty over going concern, all of these extra bits. That really does seem to be the area of reporting that they like to examine. That's something they've done a lot in recent exam sittings and was heavy in December 23 as well. So again, something I probably would say will continue because the examiner always comments the students do terribly on these extra paragraphs. Now, quality management, I tipped this to come up, and it did come up as one of the big Section B questions. So hopefully you were well prepared for that. And it looked like a fairly standard quality management question to me, where you were given issues around how the audit had been performed and asked to comment on those issues. Now that is something the examiner has flagged as being very examinable, and repeatedly, well, they seem to put it in every single exam paper now, so it's one to really watch out for. I tipped this, but I wasn't really saying anything particularly or difficult or going out on a limb with it because it's coming up every time. And, well, very strangely in this exam, there was nothing on non-audit engagements, like assessing a forecast or doing some due diligence. The exam focused on audit only. That's unusual. That's not something we've seen for quite some time. So if you're using this to prepare for later exam sittings, I would say that makes non-audit engagements more likely to come up in the future. In section A of the exam, there were two variants. The first of them was a company called Jupiter. And what Jupiter did, well, it was a crowdfunding platform and it was unlisted. Now, the first part of this was business risks, and for you to be able to analyse those business risks effectively, you had to really understand what crowdfunding is. Now, that's not something that's really in the AAA syllabus in any great detail. The examiner was expecting you to be well read, to understand the wider business environment, to understand this unusual and new way that businesses are obtaining funding, rather than going to a bank or individual investors to raise funds. Instead, raising small amounts in donations from lots of individuals. And to really assess the business risks facing Jupiter, you had to understand that business model. That made it hard for students who didn't have such good wider business understanding as perhaps some others. Now, part B of the question, the risks of material misstatement, a lot of these focused on corporate governance weaknesses. Okay, this was an unlisted business that was run by a group of friends, and it didn't have robust controls around corporate governance. And so a lot of the issues in this question, as I understand it, were focused on control weaknesses. Materiality was based on revenue, which is, well, something the examiner does a lot, but in the real world we rarely see. But you were then oddly told not to discuss any risks of material misstatement related to revenue. Strange, given that materiality was based on revenue. But in AAA, you have to follow the instructions given in the question. And so you would have lost out on professional skills marks if you did discuss revenue risks of material misstatement. Really important to read the question carefully. Part C and Part D, There were also some technical accounting marks around the accounting for intangible assets as part of that risk of material misstatement assessment. Now, Part C and Part D here, which were a standard procedures question on valuing a property and a standard ethics question where there was a data breach and you had to explain the auditor's responsibilities around non-compliance with rules and regulations, laws and regulations. Both of those very standard questions. The second variant of question 1, this was slightly more unusual. This had a very heavy emphasis on groups. Okay, it was a food retailer, a group audit that had 20 subsidiaries, and a lot of the risks of material misstatement and the Part C here, this component auditor planning, were around your understanding of groups. Now, this does show it's important that you read the technical articles that the examiner publishes because there has been one relatively recently on groups. Now, going through these requirements, the risks of material misstatement, as I've already said, a lot of this was about accounting for groups. There was acquisition of a subsidiary, disposal of a subsidiary. There were some that weren't accounting for things correctly, particularly in terms of intra-group sales. So quite a heavy focus in a single area of technical accounting, which is something the examiner has done in several exam variants recently. There was one not long ago that focused massively on inventory. So yeah, you really needed to know your stuff about group accounting. Now, Part B was a much more normal question around procedures, around auditing the profit on disposal of a subsidiary. And then Part C was quite an unusual question, which instead of focusing on ethics, really focused on planning issues around dealing with a component auditor and actions for the auditor to take. So this was the slightly more unusual variant of question 1, and for this one, where people got this variant, they often reported that they found it more difficult. Now, moving into section B of the exam, as usual, one of the section B questions focused on reporting. And my understanding is that there were 2 reporting questions. You would have got one of these 2 variants. Although I've had the odd person who said they actually got both of these variants. But most people just got one of these. And the first variant of this question was reporting to those charged with governance, which is something that I tipped to come up. So I was very happy to see that. And in the second part of it, you had to critically evaluate an audit report focusing on an emphasis of matter paragraph. Now, but that emphasis of matter paragraph and the second variant, which focused on key audit matters, both of those are extra paragraphs in the audit report, and an area that the examiner has really heavily focused on in recent exam sittings, showing that you really need to know your stuff on extra paragraphs if you're preparing for future exam sittings. Now, very unusually, in this second variant, the key audit matters one, there was a knowledge question where you didn't have to use the scenario, but you had to explain a bit about why the key audit matters section is there and how it helps. Now, that is very unusual. We haven't had a question that hasn't relied on a scenario for many years. But my understanding is you could actually still go into the scenario and still pick out some things that would be useful from the key audit matters information that was given. And if you had a good understanding of key audit matters, you would have been fine with that question. Most students reported that although they weren't expecting to see 5 marks on a knowledge question, they came up with some reasonable points. The rest of that key audit matters section question was much more standard, evaluating what should go into, or evaluating 3 key audit matters sections, saying what was good about them and what was bad about them. Now, the third part of this question, professional and ethical issues, for 7 marks, it's unusual for us to see that sort of question in section B, but my understanding is that linked in with students who got the second variant in section A, the second variant that didn't really have ethics in it. You then got your ethics here in this key audit matters question to make sure that you got a balanced amount of the syllabus across your entire exam paper if you didn't get any ethics in section A. Now, the other section B question, the non-reporting question, as far as I could work out, there was actually only 1 question variant here. Very unusual. We normally get 2 or 3 variants of the exam in this question, but it seemed like there was only 1. And it focused on quality management. So I was pleased to see that because this is one of the topics that I tipped heavily. And I wrote it into my mock exams to make sure that students were covered on this. So I was very happy to see this come up, but I was less happy to see that there was an 8-mark knowledge question that didn't rely on the scenario, asked you generally how quality management can improve an audit. And it seems there was a slight difference in this question, depending on which variant of the exam paper you were sitting, if you were an international student or if you were sitting the UK or Ireland syllabus. The UK and Ireland syllabus focused on a specific UK and Ireland document, where ISQM2, whereas I think the international variant just talked generally about quality management. But there would be a wide range of answers that would score marks here. So as long as, even if you weren't expecting this sort of question, as long as you were practical and thought about wider stakeholders and who can benefit from a more robust audit quality, like the users of the financial statements and management and the auditor, then you'd come up with a lot of relevant points here. So although this was unusual, I think a student with good exam technique would still have scored lots of marks. Now, the second part of this question around quality management failings for 12 marks, this was a much more normal question. You were given lots of issues around the planning and performance of the audit, a junior doing work that they shouldn't, not gathering enough evidence, not testing controls over the whole year, the engagement letter being issued at the wrong point before client due diligence had been, money laundering checks had been done. And the engagement quality control review having been done by a non-independent partner. Okay, there were typical quality management failings in that question. And there were also some deficiencies in acceptance of the client. Should we really have taken that client on? So there were issues across all phases of the audit for you to pick out there. And my understanding is there were lots of issues you could go at to get those 12 marks. So this one was a much more standard question, and I think most students would have been on comfortable ground had they prepared appropriately for the exam in part B of this question. Now, I hope you found this recording useful. Most of the students I work with are students who resit AAA. They've studied elsewhere, they haven't got the level of support that they need, and so they come to me for next time around. And I get amazing pass rates. Okay, you can see my official pass rate statistics on screen here. So if the exam didn't go so well for you in December and you need support in resitting, get in touch, because I'm here to help you and I get amazing pass rates with students just like you.